You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and today I'm asking a question I did not believe I would ever ask. Is stress actually underrated? Would you ever choose to do something specifically to get stressed? Is this an experience you enjoy? An experience you would even pay for? And if not, have you been missing out all these years? Sure, stress is usually thought to be pretty bad. I mean, massive health risks, chances of heart attacks, you name it. But you know what else causes heart attacks? Fear. And a lot, and I mean a lot of people love being scared. They turn up in droves at the promise of 90 minutes to 2 hours of unrelenting fear-inducing trauma. Promise terror, and they're there. Can't sleep in the dark for 2 weeks? Yes, please. Develop a phobia for the sea because there may be a shark lurking there? Sounds like a fair deal. Fear is bankable. And the genre horror literally exists to cater to this large demand. So I suppose the question is then, does stress have the same potential? Is stressor the genre we have been missing out all of these years? Maybe, because lately the term stress has been used to positively describe some pretty big films. Hell, it was arguably one of the main selling points of Uncut Gems. So, with that in mind, can the stressor finally flourish? What are some of the most stress-inducing films made so far? And why on earth does my co-host Tom just love being stressed so much? I mean, seriously, this episode would not exist if not for Tom. So let's get started with you. What is it with stress that is just so damn appealing to you?
Thanks, Chris. So I'm really excited to talk about this today. And I absolutely love being stressed while watching films. I've always enjoyed watching films that provoke a strong reaction from the viewer, regardless of what that reaction may be. And being stressed, being anxious is just another way for a film to deliver that emotional kick to me as a viewer, to have me really invested in what's going on in the screen, to get my heart racing and really just feel the experience that the director and the actors are creating on the screen. So I think for me, it's just the way that it makes me feel. It's kind of like a buzz, a rush. You could almost compare it to going on a scary roller coaster at a theme park. I like feeling stressed and being put in this situation that I know is only temporary. At the end, the film's finished, I turn it off, back to normal. So it's just something that I enjoy experiencing. And when a film has the ability to make me feel that way, it's usually going to be a pretty good one. So I'm looking forward to discussing a number of films that hit the spot in that regard today.
Very good, Tom. And I would love to bring you into the episode now, so because I know you're a horror fan as well, and so you at least enjoy being scared. Can you understand Tom's love of stress, and do you share his, shall we say, amorous feelings?
Hi, Chris. I don't think I actually like being scared as such. I am really big into horror films, but mainly because they tend to push the envelope a lot in terms of storytelling. Scary films can be involving, and I guess stressful films is a little bit different. Like Tom said, it's about the emotional kick and the fact that if it is stressful and you feel for the characters, it can be quite a roller coaster ride. I don't really enjoy stressful films, although enjoy might be the wrong term for it. But I don't really watch films to be stressed, so when a film is very stressful, I do find it hard to watch in one viewing. I know with a couple of films we're going to be talking about today, they're films that I needed to pause or watch in a few parts because it was too much to take in at once. So, yeah, I'm not sure what it is about stress. It is a bit, I'm wondering if it's a bit about viewer desensitization and about needing to get something out of a film. I mean, if a film is stressful and you're feeling the same stress as the characters, then you're very involved and you're very invested with it. It's a little bit less passive than just watching your average family drama play out. So I get the appeal of it, but I'd say that stressful films aren't something that I usually actively seek out. And I don't know if I'm sitting down to watch a film that's described as stressful, it may not exactly be something that I'll end up loving at the end of it.
But I think you both make a very good case for why stress is impactful and how it works in films and how it gets your heart racing. And I can certainly agree there. So to be honest, before this topic came up, I had rarely thought about stress specifically in film. I think when Uncut Gems came out, there was this large social media campaign of sorts to just sell home how stressful it was. And people would write things like, this is the most stressed I've ever been in my life, and things like that. And I thought, oh wow, that sounds slightly different. Thinking about it now, there's obviously lots of very stressful film. But often when I've thought about them, I have thought about things like films that make me uneasy or films that make me anxious. But in looking into this episode and the kind of films we'll be mentioning later on, it's clear that there's a lot of films that knows how to get under your skin, how to stress you, and are better for it. So I'll really be looking forward to hearing a bit more about what it is about stress that works so well, how it's different from horror, and just start unpacking this a little bit. And I guess my first proper question to you on this topic is, what is it that actually makes a film stressful, and is it the same things that stress you in real life?
That's a great question, Chris. I don't think it is the same things that would stress me out in real life, and that's partly because a big factor of my enjoyment of the movies is the kind of escapism. We're experiencing situations that we would never experience in real life, and a lot of them involve characters who are put in precarious situations where everything that could go wrong does go wrong. And for me, that is kind of a good hallmark of whether a film is stressful or not. Some of them will start with the stress from the early scenes, and some will kind of build up with a little anxiety and then gradually hit you over the head with a load of stress that just gets worse and worse as it progresses. I think for me, part of the enjoyment is this kind of instant gratification that Sol mentioned previously. Now, I do also enjoy thought-provoking films that will improve upon reflection, but they do tend to require more investment from the viewer, and I find you have to be in the right frame of mind for them. If I've had a long day at work or I'm tired, putting on a film that involves a lot of concentration and a lot of focus may not be the right thing to do. But if I've got a film such as a horror or another film that ventures into territory that makes me feel stressed, it brings me out of that funk that I may have after a long day at work because of kind of instant gratification, the feelings that it provokes. And one of the big factors I find of making a film feel stressful is often the score, the soundtrack. That can be employed to great use to kind of ratchet up the tension. So we'll get into films that employ that technique. I'm interested to see what you and Sol have to say on this.
One of the things that has been stressing me the most, or at least I've noticed that has been working the best in terms of just inducing stress for me, is when you're more or less trapped in one kind of environment, be that, a small house, a small room with just a lot of people, and there's just so much going on. So there's hectic tension all over the place. I mean, just to mention some names in passing, I think Shiva Baby or Krisha, or for a very extreme example, Mother, where you kind of feel like there's just so much going on. And I think films being hectic in general are really quick to increase stress for me. I also think just bang on there, Tom, just as in horror, the music choices are such a big part of how stressed you can get, because if you get that music just right, if you get those notes just right, it's so easy to get your heart pounding, to be on the edge of your seat, to feel uncertain about what's going on. So I would say first, very tight spaces. Second, hectic, lots of things going on. And third, music. There's obviously so much else that can induce stress, but those are three really quick things that came to my mind. And in terms of whether or not it's the same things that would stress me in real life, I suppose to an extent. But I suppose in real life, it's more work things and stuff like that would stress me. So like deadlines, large projects, hitting certain targets. I don't think a film has ever accurately or effectively brought those kinds of stresses to life for me. Perhaps that's lucky, because I would relate too much.
Like Chris, the things that stress me the most in real life are probably work-related, which generally is quite different to what's depicted on film. In terms of films that I find stressful, I agree with Chris about space being invaded. That's probably one of the big ones. When I've had to have a lot of people over at my house, it has been quite stressful because you don't know where people are going, if something's going to get broken. So films like Shiver Baby and Mother, which he mentioned, are great examples of films like that, which convey real life stresses for me. In general, though, I'd say with the films that I find the most stressful are the ones where you've got likable, or I guess at least three-dimensional characters who are in situations where it doesn't anything is going to go right. So where there's like an imminent danger of something happening to them, and there doesn't seem to be any possibility of getting out of it. And probably the most stressful films are the ones that are paced like a thriller. So even if it's not a thriller as such, it plays out like a thriller, or I guess like a horror thriller, just because there's so much danger in there that anything could possibly happen at any possible moment. And I do agree with both of my co-hosts also that music is a very large part, or at least the soundtrack is a very large part in what can make a film more heightened and even more stressful than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, I love that you brought up films with imminent danger as well. And that made me think of one more thing that often makes me a bit stressed, which is when you have these flaky characters which are always about to be found out, or which makes you uneasy. I mean, we brought these up a lot in our 2021 podcast. And films like, for instance, Grit, which I know you guys didn't respond to as much as me, where you just have this character who just digs a bigger and bigger hole for herself. And, you just wait for the confrontation or just experience the confrontations. That's one of those other things that can be really stressful. And I suppose I would also add, in that case, confrontations to the list of things that can really, really easily stress me.
I like what you said there, Chris, about the character in Grit digging a larger hole for herself. Often it's the anticipation of things that we expect to come that makes us feel stressed. And I feel that there's a lot of films which prey on these kind of insecurities with characters who are lost in precarious situations. For instance, Sandra Bullock in Gravity. That was an incredibly stressful film the first time I watched it. And then also you've got things like 127 Hours as well. That's a pretty stressful experience. These are outside the horror genre, but it shows that stress doesn't have to be contained to horrors or necessarily thrillers. 127 Hours is, more of a drama, really. It takes place in pretty much one spot. But it shows that stress is something that shouldn't be restricted by genre.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. And films like, for instance, Shiva Baby and Krisha are very stressful dramas as well. So it's good that stress can be used more or less across the board. Maybe we'll even think of some pretty stressful comedies later on. I'm sure there must be some of those. But talking about genre, as you mentioned, and thinking of how interesting it would be if there actually were a large quantity of these super stressful films were bulked together under a moniker such as The Stressor. If we saw this develop, what tropes do you think filmmakers should popularize? You talked about a little bit about what stresses us the most, but say, what would the equivalent of the jump scare within the horror genre be to the stressor? And which of these tropes do you think we would get tired of first?
I suppose the main one is the building up of tension, and it's something that we often see in war films where there's an unexploded bomb or more than one unexploded bomb or unexploded mine. And I think that would be a trope that would get tired if it's something we saw regularly in so-called stressor films. But as it is, films involving bombs and mines are kind of restricted to the war genre, so I don't know if it would be something that could easily be adopted for other genres that fit within the stressor. But I think that it's that kind of building up of tension that is the main trope that comes to mind for me. One example of that is a film that I recommended to Sol and it stressed him out, which is Kajaki. Brilliant war film about a group of soldiers who found themselves in a part of land which is just covered in landmines. So that's definitely worth seeking out if it's one you haven't watched yet.
The film that Tom's talking about is Kajaki, Kilo 2 Bravo. And yes, that was incredibly stressful because they're stuck in a minefield. They have no idea where their mines are, and they have to move their injured colleague. And then they've got other people arriving, like helicopter people trying to come in and help them, unaware that it's a minefield. And they've got the potential that they might cause more chaos if the wind bursts, I guess might be the term, from the helicopter move things around in the field. So yeah, no, that was an incredibly stressful film. In terms of tropes, I guess it's a bit hard to say because I don't know if stressor is really a genre, whether it's a genre that Chris has invented and is hoping is going to catch on after this podcast is released.
Oh, definitely. It's my path into Wikipedia fame.
So, yeah, I don't know if I've seen enough films to actually say what are the tropes or what are the common conventions of there. I think a lot of stressful films that I'm thinking of do have a lot of handheld camera work, and I guess a lot of them also tend to have things, suddenly coming out. So I don't know if that's really equivalent of the jump scare. I don't think it is. I think it is sort of different, but I don't think I've really got enough of a hang on what stressful films are out there to make a judgment call. But I guess, yeah, the handheld stuff and also like films with very elongated shots. Like I found 1917, the Sam Mendes film, quite stressful also, and that's all done in pretty much one take or designed to be one or two or three takes. And yeah, you've got Kajaki also, and then you've got Help, which is the film which gave this podcast idea. It's a 2021 COVID-related drama, and Tom asked us to watch it for the podcast. I'm sorry if it's a spoiler, for our best films of 2021. And after watching that, I put it as a podcast idea why Tom likes being stressed at the movies, because that's an incredibly stressful film, and there's a 21-minute single take there of this woman walking around the nursing home by herself because she's the only worker who's not self-isolating with COVID and just to deal with all these patients and everything. So I guess those very long takes and the handheld stuff does seem to be a bit of a commonality in stressful cinema, but I don't know if I've seen enough stressful cinema to be able to really be an expert on it.
Those are some great points, Saul, and I can't believe we didn't mention the handheld cameras earlier, because in so many of these stressful films that we mentioned so far, handheld cameras, just the fact that the camera is shaking as much as our character's world in a way, it is such a big part of why they induce stress. Nothing is stable. So that's certainly one tool that may end up becoming too overused and we end up being too used to if the stressor, and please mention me in the Wikipedia article if this term catches on, ever takes proper form as a genre. In terms of what I think could be equivalent to the jump scare, I was really hoping that you guys would have something there because I don't know either. Maybe just the character screaming down someone's throat. I mean, think Whiplash, or even going back to Full Metal Jacket. I mean, those scenes with someone just utterly screaming at someone, you're seeing the impact. That's one of those scenes that could certainly become very overused. And I can also see that there's this general tropes, the shifty character, just like in Uncut Gems, Grit, etc., who digs a bigger hole for themselves. That's definitely something that could be overused long term, as is, close locations, etc. But I do think that the stressor, just because it's a different kind of emotion, has a much bigger range and might not fall into the same basic conventions that horror has.
Sol made a great point about films that use long takes effectively to build up the stress. And I would totally agree there that a lot of these stressor films utilize that. They have a way of, placing you into the heart of the environment that is stressing out the protagonist. And you've got films such as Help. Then you've also got films like 1917, he mentioned. Things like Wreck as well, the Spanish zombie horror. Irreversible, Angst, the Austrian film. A lot of these are verging on horror territory, but they use these long takes from the point of view of the character, and they really do build up the stress. And a lot of them are accompanied with great soundtracks and scores that build up the stress as well. With Irreversible, Gaspar Noé actually used some sounds that are inaudible to the human ear, but have an effect inducing a feeling of anxiety in the audience. So when audiences saw that in the cinema with the right sound equipment, it'd have a really uncomforting effect on them. And I think utilizing things like that is a really impressive and clever way of manipulating the audience.
The bigger question, because of what Chris is mentioning with horror tropes, is whether all stressful films could be considered to be horror films. Horror films, by definition, or apparently the definition on IMDb, is films where characters are constantly scared or constantly in fear for their life. So, by that definition, a lot of stressful cinema could be considered to be horror films. And I guess a lot of stressful cinema is scary. Films like Mother is scary. I actually shot Shiver Baby, played out a lot like a horror film. I'm not sure about the other examples I've got, but I think there would be a case to be made that even something like Kajaki is a bit of a horror film because, yeah, it's the horrors of war in there and the stresses of what's going on. So I think there's a bit of room there to debate whether stressful cinema is actually a subgenre of the horror genre.
That's a really great point, Sol. I think that's interesting to discuss, because is stress a form of horror or terror? I think that in many of these stressful films we've been discussing, the characters have not really been literally scared for their life. I mean, Shiva Baby, Grit, etc., the lead character is not literally scared that they will die, but it has the stress that their life in some sense will be over. So it really depends on how we categorize stress. Like, for instance, let's take Whiplash, which is often mentioned as a really stressful film, which is, this film about essentially a music teacher acting like a drill sergeant, just screaming at his protagonist the entire time. Would that possibly classify as horror? Maybe. With a film like Krishna, where you have a mother coming back to see her son after abandoning him years before, and he's been adopted by her family, and just kind of being so uneasy in those surroundings, would that qualify as horror? I mean, and maybe, because you have that unease, you have that trembling fear and uncertainty that are part of the horror genre, and there are horror genres that aren't necessarily that scary. Take Giallo, for instance, which is often closer to thrillers. So I do think that there is a good argument there, so definitely.
It is a very interesting question there, and it kind of comes into the idea of how a film makes you feel as opposed to the content and the themes of the film. So looking at those ways of classifying a film and its genre. And I've got a list of stressful films in front of me, and I'm going through and trying to find films that perhaps would fall out of this bracket that Sol just described using his definition. And they all have characters who are in situations where they're fearful. And even though I would never see some of them in a list of top horror films, things like Captain Phillips, for instance, 1917, Sorcerer, and Wages of Fear. They're not horror films per se, but they all involve characters who are for their life. And I think this has opened up a very interesting discussion.
Definitely, and I would love to also hear a little bit more about how stress relates to and compares to fear, because as I mentioned in the intro and as we've been discussing now, they're not just very much related in terms of how they're induced and how they make us feel, but they're also similar in the sense that they are very negative experiences. They're both heart attack inducing experiences. They're things that people often try to avoid in real life, though of course you have houses of terror, you don't have houses of stress necessarily. But how do you think stress relates to fear, and does it have more or less the exact same heart-pounding appeal? And adding to that, would you have liked to go to an amusement park and see a house of stress?
I like that idea, Chris. I would. I'd be along for that ride.
Of course you would.
See if I can make it through to the other side. It's quite a difficult question to think about, trying to separate the notion of fear and stress, because, as you say, they often go hand in hand. When you're watching horror film, you're kind of anxious for those upcoming scares, and when you're watching film that makes you feel stressed, you're not scared per se, but you're still experiencing similar feelings. Your heart is pumping and you're on the edge of your seat because of the anxiety that the film is inducing. And there is a clear separation, because a film like Captain Phillips, for instance, it's not scary, it doesn't scare you, but it does make you feel that stress. But it is hard to pinpoint where one ends and the other begins. And I think for me, it often depends on what I mentioned with the content and the themes of the film. If there's paranormal elements involved, or if there's brutal murders and killing, then that's topics that are more likely to make me feel scared than stressed. Anything else that doesn't involve those themes is probably just primarily making me stressed.
I really feel like I need to re-listen to the podcast we made on what scares us, because, as Tom said, the distinction between fear and stress is not airtight. It's not really certain where stress begins, where fear ends, whether they're overlapped. I guess no matter how you look at it, whether you look at something as being stressful or something being fear-inducing, either way, it's making you feel alive when watching it, which I think is the appeal of stressful cinema. Something I said before, people don't want to be passively watching a film, they want to be actively involved in it. And one of, I guess, the easiest ways, I don't know if it's easy as such, but one of the simpler ways to get audience involvement is to make something stressful, or to make something scary or something fearful. It's a lot less work, I guess, rather than trying to get a drama and get you heavily invested in a drama. I mean, there are some really great dramas that obviously do invest you in the characters quite well, but I suppose stressful and fearful situations are a bit more universal, and it's something which an audience member can easily get involved in very early on without getting to know all the characters first, understand all the situations, which is a bit more tangible. So I guess maybe that's the right word. Fearful or stressful cinema is very tangible. In terms of the difference between them, yeah, I don't know. I'd say even Captain Phillips has got a bit of horror elements in there, with the pirates boarding their ship and you don't know what's going through their heads and what are they going to do and how they're going to react. So I think there is a bit of horror in there, although obviously it's very different to Paranormal Activity, although I'd say it's actually scarier than Paranormal Activity. But that's coming as somebody who doesn't like Paranormal Activity.
Yeah, I think you're very much right there, so that it's a little bit hard to know exactly where stress ends and fear begins, and vice versa, though obviously we can pinpoint the outer layers of films that are purely stressful but not scary, and purely scary but not necessarily stressful. And obviously horror also has many other elements, such as gory, which might stress some people, you don't know. I don't know if I would do a House of Stress. Maybe if I went there with you, Tom, and I would just watch your face and see how much you were enjoying all of it. But like I mentioned, I'm quite new to seeking out stress specifically, so maybe my mind will be changed on that. One thing I have often sought out, though, has been dark films that, for instance, disturb me. And I have always loved films that make me uneasy. And we haven't really gone into these subcategories and feelings yet, which are, I guess, somewhere in between fear and stress, perhaps, or just adjacent. Namely, the feelings and experience of being anxious and the feeling and experience of being uneasy, because these are two things that almost go hand in hand with stress. It's really hard to untangle them. There's some cases where I can say, okay, this film is more anxious and stressful, etc. But to give a very quick example, Mother is very stressful. If I had to use a label, I would probably have said anxiety-inducing rather than stress-inducing, for instance. Especially because I remember when I watched that film, my wife called out from the other room and I was like, what the hell are you watching? I'm getting really anxious in here. So you have those more clear distinctions. But do you think feeling of stress and the feeling of anxiety and the feeling of unease more or less in general go hand in hand and are present in the same films?
I think they do often go hand in hand, but what you've said has made me think about something that has an impact on the stress for the audience. And I think it's the pacing of the film. As an example, I'd like to mention Come and See. It's not a film that particularly stressed me out, but it does induce that kind of anxiety and unease. And I think part of why it doesn't stress me out is because it's quite a long film with a slow build-up. It is an assault on the senses, but there's breathing room between the events and what happens. Whereas with some films that induce the stress, they never let up. They're constant all the way through. You're always on the edge of your seat. So I think that it is worth mentioning that the pacing of a film can have a big impact on how successful it is in inducing stress in the audience.
That's just a perfect example, Tom, and I completely agree. I mean, Come and See is one of the most anxiety-inducing films ever made, and it's also a film that just makes you thoroughly uneasy. It's also thoroughly disturbing, but while I can see it stressing some people, I don't think I would put it at the top of, for instance, a most stressful films list. Even though it immerses you in the world of the character and you feel like you're there with them, it does have that breathing room that exists that in some way makes the terror feel harsher, but it doesn't stress you. And I think you're also completely right that most stressful films are hectic, they're fast-paced. That's a very good distinction.
It's quite an interesting point that a lot of stressful films do seem very fast paced because I guess to use some examples that have come up already, you've got something like Shiver Baby, something's always happening, there's always somebody coming up to approach her or talk to her. So from that point of view, it is very stressful. I can think of a film which is even more fast paced, which I've got on my list of very stressful films. It's called The Night Comes From Us. It's from Indonesia. And it's an action film about a triad assassin and his friends trying to protect a young girl who's like a daughter of this bigwig who gets murdered. But anyway, they have to keep protecting her, and they keep getting attacked by counter assassins left, right, and center. And I described it as a heart attack inducing experience. I think I call it Heart Attack Cinema 101. And it's been compared to The Raid, but it's actually even more action packed than that. I mean, it's not as good as The Raid is, but the action is really in there. There's constantly somebody about to attack and kill this kid. They constantly have to fight to protect her. So that is very fast paced. However, another film that I want to talk about in this podcast is Play by Ruben Östlund. And I found that a very stressful film, and that's not fast paced. What the film is about, it's about a group of bullies who have got this scheme where they pick on a few kids who are walking around by themselves and tell them that they have a stolen phone. And there's a whole lot of coercion going on in there. And just watching that film, I was very stressed out the whole time for the innocent victims of it and how they're being tagged along. We don't know whether the bullies are going to take them, whether they're going to attack them, whether they're going to hurt them, whether they're going to steal their stuff. I wouldn't say it's slowly paced as such, but it's very gradually paced, maybe that might be a better term. So it's not something happening left, right, and center. It's not very fast paced, but I still was full of anxiety the whole time around in terms of what are going to happen to these kids and what the bullies are going to do to it, and whether it is just a game or not, or whether something more sinister is going to happen. So I think stressful cinema is more often fast paced, but I think slower paced films do have the potential to be as stressful depending on how they're filmed. And part of it is just by the way that Austrian films play. A lot of it is from very long shots. It's very long shots. And from like high camera angles, looking down at the characters, so always at a helpless distance, which I think is a really interesting way of making a situation more stressful, being forced to observe it, but never being there with the characters as such, being able to intervene. So I don't know. I guess I would say, yeah, stressful films do tend to be fast paced, but slow ones I think can be equally as stressful.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Sol, in terms of why a film that is so, I'm not going to say slow either. It does have some contemplative elements, I suppose, but a more leisurely paced film, if you will, if you can call it that. Film like the type of cinema that Östlund produces can still be stressful, and that is the fact that you are so far away from the characters, and it's also the themes he's playing with and what's happening inside of the frame, because Östlund really enjoys playing with more awkward sensibilities. He's not the first filmmaker I would think of when I think of stress. I tend to think of him more along with terms such as unease, films that make you feel awkward to an extent. Some of these films, like for instance, Tourist, or force majeure, as it's called in English, also have a degree of shame or a degree of the similar thing we have with Grit 2, you have a character who's kind of trying to dig themselves out of a hole of sorts that plays into. I think with Play in particular, though, it's just these somewhat disturbing and easy situations that also play in with feelings of, for instance, potentially racist imagery and characters being very uneasy and uncomfortable about that as well. And it just raises that tension from that. And I think that's where the stress really comes from. And in those later films, you have similar things that even though they're more leisurely paced, you have characters who are really uneasy, really awkward. You don't know what's going to happen to them. And he builds up so much tension around what will happen there, that it's still, even though they're more leisurely paced, you feel that a lot is still going on. It's kind of like this very emotional underbelly that's rumbling below the quietness. So I think Östlund is a very good pick there, so.
And you are spot on, Chris, about Ostlund's framing. He's pretty much the master of unusual and awkward framing. I'm thinking about films like Involuntary, which he did before Play, and you've got these characters talking and they're behind a bus, and all you can see is like from their feet up to maybe about their knees, and the rest of them is cut off because they're behind the bus. And they're talking about in that story about whether or not to keep the bus going because he wants somebody to admit to breaking something in the bathroom. And yeah, a lot of Ostlund is about blame and responsibility. And I'm not going to go on too much about him because I'd love to do a podcast just on Ostlund himself. But yeah, blame and responsibility go throughout all his films. Force majeure, like you said, about accepting blame or not accepting blame, and all the long distance shots as we're looking down at the characters from a distance. Something like Square is just really great with its framing. You have meetings in there between the art gallery staff, and you can't see everybody at the table. So having these meetings, these people are talking, suddenly it cuts, and somebody didn't realize who's there is actually also there and able to contribute to it also. So he does lots of interesting things, and whether you regard it as stress cinema or something else, he does definitely play with our emotions quite a bit.
I've only seen The Square from Ostlund, so I'm very intrigued to check out more his work from what you've been saying. So maybe I will be able to record that podcast with you soon, Sol, if I get through the rest of his films.
What a great build-up. Now I'm even more excited with this episode. We are selling Tom on Östlund through stress. And to maybe throw out some more recommendations, then let's talk a little bit about what the most stressful films we have seen are. What stressful films stand out as the best, both as films and as in terms of just the amount of stress they induce in us.
I might go first this time because I know Tom's an expert on stressful cinema, and he's got about 1,000 films to share. So by the time he gets through all of that, my ones will probably already be covered. I had 6 that I wanted to talk about during the podcast, and we've already talked about Kajaki. We've already talked about The Night Comes For Us. We've already talked about Play. We've already talked about Shiver Baby. So the other two, one of them is actually not a Tom recommendation, amazingly enough, so I'm not sure if he's seen it or not. It's a film called Eye in the Sky. It came out around 6 or 7 years ago, starring Helen Mirren, and she's part of a team that's trying to track down these planned suicide bombers. And they've basically got aerial surveillance, and they've worked out where these suicide bombers are and where they're like the houses that they're using as a headquarters, and they're about to like hit a missile there and take them out when suddenly a girl wanders off the street and starts selling some stuff in the area. And the whole film was about the debate over there, do we nuke this place and possibly get this girl killed or injured, or can we try and intervene and get her out of there? And it's the only film that I'm talking about in the podcast that I've actually seen in the cinema, except for 1917. So of these 6 films that I lined up, it's the only film that I saw cinematically. And in the cinema, I was just like really stressed. I was watching with my parents, and my mum turned to me and just like, "Are you all right?" or whatever. It's just really intense. So that one I just thought I'd give a mention to. And the other one is a Tom recommendation, because most of the stressful films that I see do come from Tom. So it's a film from Tunisia called Beauty and the Dogs. And like we said, with the long shots and how that seems to be a trope in stressful cinema, it's shot in 9 single unbroken takes. And what it does is it chronicles the difficulties that a young woman has trying to report a rape in the dead of night. And because it's in Tunisia, a very Arab-heavy country, she's met with a mixture of scorn and apathy, and things are only complicated by the fact that her rapists are police officers, which makes it even harder to report, and nobody believes her. And the whole thing for me was just a living nightmare. And I was just found it very difficult to view. I think I turned it off halfway through, and I messaged Tom and I said, I'm really sorry. I know you've nominated this for the doubling of the canon exercise, but I don't think I can finish this. Of course, I did eventually go back and finish watching the film, but it was just one of those where I couldn't watch it without stopping or pausing it to have a break, because it was just a constant barrage of things. The one thing which I didn't like about the film, which we haven't mentioned yet, is it did feel a bit misery porn-like to me. So I think that's one of the things about stressful cinema. Sometimes it's just banks on everything that can go wrong, does go wrong, and Beauty and the Dogs is a bit like that. And some of the other films we might end up mentioning are a bit like that also. And I'm not a really big fan of everything that does go wrong can go wrong cinema, because it's not really as spontaneous as other forms of cinema. But look, if you're into stressful cinema, Beauty and the Dogs is a hard film to overlook. It's definitely one of the most accomplished films that I've seen to come out from Tunisia.
That sounds like a really intriguing film. I've just added it to my watch list.
Thanks for mentioning Beauty and the Dogs, Sol. You sold that well. I absolutely love the film, and I'm pleased to see that it is picking up some traction amongst the people on the ICM forum who've watched it so far. It is an incredible film, very powerful, very stressful, and as Sol mentioned, it makes the use of the long take brilliantly to put you in the heart of this awful situation, and it really does have you on the edge of your seat throughout to see how it's going to pan out. Now, I haven't seen Eye in the Sky, but that is now going to the top of my watch list. So thanks for the recommendation on that, Sol. Now, it's hard to pick out which film stressed me out the most, but I'm going to go with a Spanish film from 2010 called Secuestrados, or Kidnapped in its English language title. Now, this is a film that, again, is shot in just 12 long takes. It's a home invasion thriller about a family who come under siege from some men who invade their home, and it is so intense and uncomfortable throughout. The film makes use of split screens where we're seeing the action unfold in 2 separate scenes. So there's a bit where the father of the house is taken to a cash point to get some money out to kind of appease the criminals, and you're watching that on the left side of the screen, and then on the right side of the screen you've got his wife and his daughter who are struggling to fight off these criminals that have been left in the home with them, and it's just so stressful. You're torn between two stressful situations at the same time, and it's just incredibly uncomfortable cinema. The first time I watched it, I was hungover, so I wasn't in the best frame of mind, but I put it on, and wow, it hit me like a sledgehammer. I think it was a rental when Love Film used to exist. It arrived in the post, and as soon as that film finished, I went online and I bought my own for the DVD so I could watch it again. I have lent it to friends who have had similar experiences to me, so it hasn't gone wasted. But I know that at some point when I'm desperate for a stressful film, that's in my collection, and I am looking forward to revisiting it. I'd just like to give a shout out to one other film, which I did mention briefly, which is Sorcerer, which is William Friedkin's remake of the 1953 French film Wages of Fear. Now, this builds up the stress and anxiety so well. It's about four men who are all running from their past, who take a perilous job driving trucks full of explosives through a jungle to reach an oil field, and along the way there's so many obstacles and dangers that they must pass. The best of all is a rickety bridge that they encounter in the middle of a harsh storm where it's raining and the wind is shaking the bridge, and they've got these huge trucks that they're driving along the bridge, and they know just one false move will spell their certain doom, and it is incredible filmmaking. So I would recommend it to everyone, whether you want to be stressed out or whether you just want to see a very good film.
That's a great list of quite varied films, Tom. So thank you for that. And I would also like to say that I've seen Eye in the Sky. It's a very good film, and just to throw it into that, it was a wonderful late career performance by Alan Rickman in that film as well. So there's many reasons to seek that one out. In terms of films that really stressed me out, I think I mentioned all of the big ones already. Mother is probably the most anxiety-inducing film I've ever seen. It's so incredibly, viscerally overpowering with so much going on at all time. It just feels huge, and it's impossible to even catch your breath. So categorizing that as stress, that's a really great contender for it. Anyone watching this film will have their heart pounding in their chest and feel so uneasy, essentially for the entire runtime. A less known film that I already mentioned and we've all seen because it is mentioned in our 2021 podcast, Grit. That's actually the only film I can remember pausing just because it made me so damn uneasy with all of these confrontations of our lead as she just keeps digging this hole. Essentially this film follows a wannabe artist who is completely out of her depth. She can't get funding. She's never done anything truly artistic that's been remotely successful. She keeps clawing at any opportunity. She lies, she cheats, she abuses trust, and you just see her falling all over herself. It's so hard to watch, and yes, it's also so damn stress-inducing. And those are two completely different films in terms of Mother being closer to a horror film, and Grit being possibly in the, say, Östlund Dogma family kind of thing, where you have a Scandinavian cringe, if you will, but it's in no way horror unless you really just categorize stress as horror. So two very, very different experiences, both induced extreme amounts of stress in me. And this question was not planned. We've talked about it a little bit earlier about almost all stressful films being horror. And I asked, could it be that there are some stressful comedies as well? And I actually did some research on this and saw what films have been mentioned. There's two comedies that actually pop up on a lot of stressful film lists. And I wonder if you can guess which two comedies these are.
Tough one. I can't really think of any comedies that I'd class as stressful other than one which we've already mentioned, which is Shiver Baby. Other than that, I'm at a loss.
Yeah, Shiver Baby is the first one that comes to mind because I've often seen that one classified as a comedy, although I would say it's probably more of an easy comedy than anything else. I'll probably need a bit more time if I was going to guess. There probably are a few other films like Shiver Baby out there, which have a bit of the like awkward comedy in there, but I can't imagine something being like a full laugh out loud comedy also being stressful. I would say Shiver Baby is a dark comedy, so it probably is a dark comedy, and obviously one that's not springing to mind at the moment.
Yeah, I actually completely forgot about Shiva Baby. That shows up on some lists as well. And yes, that is a dark comedy. Not that I've forgotten about Shiva Baby, but I have forgotten that it was classified as a comedy. It is indeed a dark comedy, and that fits. But the two films I was talking about that actually show up on quite a few most stressful films of all time lists are more straightforward. Or no, they're not. One of them is a more straightforward comedy. The less straightforward comedy is Martin Scorsese's After Hours, that I know you guys like quite a bit. And the other one surprised me, though I can see where it's coming from, and that's His Girl Friday, the Howard Hawks film from 1941, which is obviously just this all-out hilarity, but set in a newsroom with characters talking in hyper speed and things happening around the clock. I'm not sure if I would call that film stressful myself, but I can see why some people would add it to these lists. But what do you guys think?
I'm not a huge fan of His Girl Friday, but it has been over 10 years since I've watched it. Maybe I need to revisit it if people are classifying it as a stressful film, because maybe I'll enjoy it this time round. Who knows? But I can certainly see where people are coming from with After Hours. It shares a lot of the tropes with the films that we've mentioned already about things going wrong and also following one character through a series of events over a small course of time, which can help to build up that tension in the stress. So that is a good recommendation there, After Hours.
I absolutely love After Hours. It's in my all-time top 20. It's one of those living, breathing nightmare sort of films. And I guess I've maybe not really thought of it as being that stressful as such. But yeah, obviously the main character is finding out a little bit of stress, or not a little bit of stress. He actually is quite stressed during a lot of the film. But yeah, I just love the films like After Hours, the Keanu Reeves film, The Night Before, films like Into the Night. There actually seem to be quite a lot of those in the 1980s, all-night adventures with like crazy things happening in the wee hours of the morning. I'm really big into films like that, and I don't know if I'll necessarily classify them as stressful as such. But yeah, I definitely really just love the idea of you not knowing what really goes on and strange things happening in the dark of night when most people are fast asleep. In terms of His Girl Friday, like Tom, I haven't seen it recently, but I have seen it a couple of times. And it's a fast-paced film, as most Howard Hawks comedies tend to be. It is quite rapidly paced, but I wouldn't really call it stressful. I think if you've watched like Kajaki and watched Uncut Gems and watched Shiver Baby, and you go, I really need some more stress, and you go and sit down and watch His Girl Friday, I think you'll be a little bit disappointed.
Yeah, I think you're quite right there. So I think people listening this might be going more for the hectic feeling, because His Girl Friday, like so many of the screwball comedies and slapstick comedies of that era, are extremely hectic, fast-paced, and for the faint of heart, maybe they'll classify as stressful in the same way that people fainted when they first, or at least are reported to have fainted when they first saw Dracula from 1931.
Yeah, or when people first saw Arrival of the Train.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe people just weren't accustomed to the amount of stress that films like Uncut Gems and Mother could bring to their lives. But talking about Uncut Gems, and also talking about the fact that so many of the films that we have been mentioning in this episode have been from the last decade or so, or even the last 5 years. It seems like maybe it was just that Toll in particular weren't that focused on stressful films before now. But at least to me, it seems like more and more films that are just going all out for the stress are popping up. And there's popular buzz about stress now in a way that I don't think there was before. I mean, going back to how Uncut Gems, for instance, was promoted as the most stressed I've ever been. Like, you saw all of these quotes. The most stressful film you'll ever see. The most stressed you'll ever be. These were used as selling points, as quotes, etc. So, do you think this marks a bit of a turning point and that there is now more of an audience that is very much eager to be stressed?
I would like to think that it does mark a turning point, especially as you mentioned with the success of Uncut Gems and the publicity it generated due to being a stressful film. And I think there is a market out there for it. It makes me wonder if some filmmakers are going down this route to create more immersive films for the viewer, because a lot of people are watching films at home where there's distractions. You got your mobile phones, people can flip between channels, and you need to be able to grab the audience in a short space of time because people's attention spans are waning. The ability to focus and sit down on watch a film uninterrupted for a couple of hours is kind of diminishing, not amongst core cinephiles, but the casual viewers. So I think making a film stressful, immersive, making it a memorable experience is a good way to connect with people who might not otherwise have the time or attention span to give 2 hours up to a film that involves more concentration or effort. So I think it does mark a turning point, and I'm all for that because I do have an attention span and I'm quite happy to watch thought-provoking films, but I also absolutely love stressful films, so I want to see more of them, and I can't wait to see this kind of subgenre that we've been discussing today kind of expanding in the coming years.
I don't know if we'll see the stressor as such really expand in years to come. We'll see how things go. I agree with Tom that stressful films are being made because they are immersive. It's something which I've mentioned a few times already. It's a less passive experience if you're feeling stressed out, like a scary film or scary inverted commas film with jump scares. It becomes more involving, and it's an easier way to suck an audience memory in rather than having to have a long drama where you have to get to know the characters first. Stress is very easy to convey without having to establish very much in the film's universe before the stressful situations begin. I guess the thing for me that I'm thinking about is most people watch films for enjoyment. I mean, hardcore cinephiles maybe not, but I think even I watch films mainly for enjoyment. So I don't know how much stressful cinema has the power to really expand beyond there. If people are wanting to watch a film because they want to unwind after work, I know when Tom wants to unwind after work, he goes and watches the most stressful thing possible. When most people want to unwind after work, they want to sit down and watch a comedy or a soap opera or something they can easily lose themselves in. So I think that's still where the biggest is at the moment in terms of being able to create something which is easy to consume and which isn't, I guess, emotionally taxing. So I think, we've seen a bit of, I mean, comedies have always been around, but comedies seem to be really, really big these days, especially with the ones that get dropped in streaming services. So I think, stressful cinema, I think it's got its place. It might take off as a niche genre. I don't really see it as an overwhelming thing because the average person when I talk to or discuss films or whatever, they're not interested in watching a film that's going to stress them out. People still want to be able to watch films because they want to enjoy, they want to unwind. And I don't think the average person wants to sit down and watch a stressful film to unwind, or they don't want to go to the cinema and pay money to be stressed out. They want to sort of lose themselves in a cinematic universe, which is probably why superhero film is more popular than stressful cinema at the moment.
Well, I think you're quite right, Saul, in that the stressor will not be the trend that will replace the superhero films. That would be a very, very tall order. But I do agree with Tom and technically myself as well when I phrased the question that we have seen more stress-inducing films come out and that they seem more bankable now, that there is at least large enough group of people that wants to be stressed, at least occasionally, that these films will continue to be made. I guess I have to cling to this belief just to get the genre stressor trademark and get my Wikipedia page and maybe do books on book signings, etc. Feel free to collaborate on that, Tom. Just ride this massive stressful wave and also get more immersive experiences, because Tom really is bang on the money there. While stress is not necessarily the feeling most people want to feel after a hard day at work, it is immersive. It does make it hard to look away in terms of enjoyment. It's perhaps debatable, but it is entertaining. Just like a horrifying horror movie may not be the most pleasant time you ever had in your life. You are engrossed in it. And I hope you have been engrossed and not too stressed out by this episode. I think we've name dropped a couple of episodes you should definitely go back to listen to, such as the What Scares Us episode, and we have quite a few horror episodes that may tempt the not so faint at heart. And until next time, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.